What's up, nerds? Welcome to our session on Matthew's narrative theology of the cross. Today we're going to focus on the end of Matthew's gospel. One of the things that we've been talking about all term is thinking about one of the best ways to understand the meaning of a narrative is to pay very close attention to what comes first and very close attention to what comes last. So we've seen the use of the Old Testament in the opening of Matthew's gospel, in particular with a pattern of quotations. And here at the end of the Matthew's narrative, we're going to see a pattern of allusions. In particular, in this session, we're going to explore how Matthew presents the crucifixion of Jesus not merely as a historical record, but as a profound theological moment, a moment that reveals the unity of Scripture, the coherence of God's redemptive plan, and the depth of divine love expressed even in lament. Our focus is going to center on Matthew 27 and its intertextual relationship with Psalm 22. This is the psalm that Jesus quotes from the cross. We're going to trace how this psalm shapes the Passion narrative, how it helps us interpret the meaning of Jesus' anguished cry, and how it provides a richer, more faithful alternative to the popular but problematic broken Trinity view. Along the way, we'll see that lament, biblical lament, is not a sign of lost faith, but an act of deep trust. The cry of the forsaken is not the sound of divine abandonment, but the sound of divine intimacy expressed in suffering. One starting point is to observe that when we compare the Gospels, a striking feature is how little space is actually given to describing the physical act of crucifixion. Mark states bluntly, "And when they had crucified him." Matthew likewise describes the moment of Jesus' death directly, and Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. So we might ask, why is this account so brief? Partly, I think part of the reason is that the gospel writers are not concerned primarily with detailing the mechanics of the act of crucifixion, this brutal technique invented by the Romans. Rather, they provide a narration and interpretation of the theological significance of Jesus' death. Matthew's focus is theological. He has already shown through his narrative in a variety of ways that Jesus' death fulfills the scriptures and reveals a divine purpose, as is said in Matthew 20:28. Jesus says there that his life will be given as a ransom for many. Matthew 26:28, at the Last Supper, Jesus speaks of the blood of the covenant that is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. So the cross shows who Jesus is, it shows what he accomplishes, and how God's covenant promises are coming to fulfillment. Now, one of the most frequently asked questions about Matthew 27 and the parallel in Mark 15 relates to Jesus' final cry from the cross in Matthew 27:46. What does Jesus mean when he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Historically, some have interpreted this as the cry of dereliction, the anguished expression of a cosmic separation within the Trinity itself, as the Father turns away from the Son. In this view, the holy God cannot look upon sin. Therefore, when Jesus became sin, the Father had to turn away. He turned his face away, he turned his back on the Son, and the most intimate of all relationships was broken. It's an emotionally powerful image, but we must ask, is this the best way to understand these words of Jesus? Is this what Matthew intended to communicate through the way that he narrates the crucifixion account? I think if we pay careful attention to this narrative and to the psalm that Jesus quotes, a different pattern, a different picture will emerge. But first, let's briefly take a look at the logic and the theologic behind what we might call the broken Trinity view. It usually rests on three major theological assertions. These theological concepts are usually also articulated with the wording of a few key texts. So, for example, number one, in Habakkuk 1, verse 13, it states that God is too pure to look on evil. So the idea that God cannot look on evil, that phrase comes from Habakkuk 1. Second, in 2 Corinthians 5:21, Paul talks about how Jesus, who knew no sin, became sin on our behalf in his death. And then finally, number three, in Galatians 3, verse 13, Paul states that Jesus became a curse because he died on the cross. The crucifixion of Jesus is then understood within this particular theological framework with these theological concepts as interpretive lenses on what is happening in the gospel accounts. So on the cross, Jesus became sin and became a curse, and therefore God had to look away because God cannot look upon evil. So he had to cast it away from his presence. The Father turned his face away. Jesus' words here in this view indicate the anguish of being ontologically separated from the love and intimacy of God the Father. Because God the Father has turned his face away for a brief time, but a treacherous time, there's a breach in the inter-Trinitarian relationship between the Father and the Son. A full theological response to this view is beyond our scope here, but we can note briefly that there are problems with each step of this reasoning. First, Habakkuk 1:13 in context is not about God's inability to be present where sin exists. It's about his character as a just judge who sees evil and confronts it. Habakkuk is complaining because it is apparent that God does in fact see evil and these evil actions, but has failed to in fact judge. In fact, even the next verse 14 in Habakkuk 1, indicates that God does see both the righteous and the wicked. Habakkuk wonders, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? In the language of Psalm 34, which is relevant here, the psalmist says in verse 15 of Psalm 34, the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears toward their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off their memory from the earth. So here we see that judgment is not the physical absence of the Lord, but rather his presence in all of his burning holiness. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his face is set against those who do evil. The wording of Habakkuk 1, in other words, doesn't seem to indicate that God has to flee from the presence of evil. Rather, that when he judges, the Lord is present as judge. Further in 2 Corinthians 5, the other text that we were talking about a few minutes ago, in 2 Corinthians 5:21, where it says that Jesus became sin, in Galatians 3, where he becomes a curse, Paul here, I think, is using representative language. Jesus bears sin and curse on behalf of sinful humanity. These are covenantal concepts. He doesn't become sin and evil itself in some sort of ontological or metaphysical transformation. Rather, it seems that Paul is arguing that Jesus bears the penalty of sin and the weight of the curse in his incarnation and his death. And then most importantly, but more broadly, Scripture affirms the unbreakable unity of the triune God. That's what we mean when we speak of God as Trinity. There's no hint in the New Testament that this eternal communion between Father, Son, and Spirit is ever ruptured, even at the cross. So instead of viewing Jesus' cry as a statement of divine separation, I think that Matthew invites us here to hear it as a scream of lament. Readers familiar with the Psalms will immediately hear echoes of lament in the passion scenes, the crucifixion scenes, not only in Jesus' cry, but in the way that the gospel authors portray this scene. For Matthew, especially in Matthew, the most significant psalm that seems to shape the crucifixion narratives is Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is the song of a righteous sufferer who feels abandoned but ultimately experiences deliverance and vindication. It begins with anguish and ends with praise. The same trajectory runs throughout Matthew's passion narrative. So let's dig into this. One of the key interpretive factors in this discussion is central to our focus here. Because it's sometimes missed in popular level discussions, it's important to reiterate that Jesus' dramatic statement is drawn directly from not just a psalm, but a psalm of lament. The critical question then is whether only this statement or the rest of the psalm is in view in the crucifixion accounts. Here we will give attention to the way that Psalm 22 shapes the crucifixion account in Matthew's narrative. So in short, the idea here is that not just the words of verse 1, but the entire psalm is not only implied, but referenced throughout the crucifixion account in Matthew 27 at strategic places. So the concept of lament is a central part of the theological framework that Jesus and the biblical authors have given us to understand the theological significance of the cross of Christ. So in relation to the broken Trinity view, part of that that view is that we need a theological framework in order to understand what is Jesus is experiencing on the cross and what that cry means. And so what I'm proposing is not that we don't need a theological framework. We do, but I'm suggesting that Jesus and Matthew have provided that framework for us, and that is the theological framework of biblical lament. So the first thing that we need to do is not only see the reference to Psalm 22 and Jesus' cry, but notice how pervasive the language and imagery of Psalm 22 is in this brief crucifixion account. The first allusion to Psalm 22 occurs at the foot of the cross when the soldiers divided his garments among them by casting lots. Matthew 27:35. The soldiers then sat down and kept watch over him there. Verse 36. In verse 38, Matthew also notes that two robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. In this scene, Jesus is surrounded with a sign above his head that mocks him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews, verse 37. In Psalm 22:18, the psalmist notes that they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Significantly, this action directly follows from the psalmist's description of a company of evildoers encircling him, staring at him and gloating over him after they have pierced his hands and feet. So here we see a scene from Psalm 22 being filled out in the crucifixion account. So that's the first major textual connection with Psalm 22. A subsequent allusion relates to the verbal abuse that Jesus receives from the crowds. As Matthew observes, those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads, verse 29. This echoes the scene in Psalm 22, where the psalmist describes the shaming words that he hears. I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. Psalm 22, 6 and 7. Now, to wag one's head involves shaking it in a kind of disgusted disapproval of the claims that are being made or derided. The act of wagging the head in the context of judgment occurs in context of prophetic rebuke and interpersonal criticism. We see this in other places in the Old Testament. Back in the crucifixion account of Matthew's Gospel, the people's chosen verbal barb also has sinister overtones. They say, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Verse 40. Here the people repeat the false charges brought against Jesus at his trial that we see in chapter 26. But these words also echo the words of the devil himself in the wilderness, "If you are the Son of God." Note, too, that the temptation with which the devil tries to trap Jesus in chapter 4 is the same throughout Jesus' ministry. to receive the kingdom without the cross. That's part of the heart of the trial that Jesus experiences at the devil's hands. If you if you bow down and worship, then you will receive all the kingdoms of the world without having to go through the cross. Here, the people tell Jesus while he's hanging on the cross, if you are the Son of God, come down from that cross. Another allusion moves from the crowds in general to the Jewish leaders in particular. After the soldiers and the crowd shame Jesus, so too the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders mock him in a similar way. They say, he saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe him. To this they add a stinging supplement. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he desires him. For he said, I am the Son of God. Verse 43. These same words are spoken by those who mock the psalmist in Psalm 22:8. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. In a tragic and ironic twist, the words of both the devil and the enemies of the Lord in Psalm 22 are voiced by the Jewish leaders at the foot of the cross. Following this, the most direct allusion to Psalm 22 is voiced by Jesus himself. Matthew notes that the land had gone dark for 3 hours. Out of this darkness comes the cry of a loud voice that says, my God, why have you forsaken me? By including the Aramaic statement, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, Matthew gives us also a snapshot of the immediate mishearing and misunderstanding of the people. Some think that he's calling for Elijah. Others think that he's saying something else. By giving the Aramaic statement, by providing that translation, and giving us an account of people mishearing and misunderstanding these words, Matthew's giving special prominence to this statement that's being made. These words, of course, convey the opening of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Verse 1 of Psalm 22. Before we finish our journey through the Psalm in Matthew 27, we can also note that there are a few further echoes of Psalm 22 that could help explain some of the distinctive aspects of Matthew's narrative. In addition to Jesus' loud cry of Psalm 22:1, Matthew notes that Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit in verse 50. Mark also records this additional cry, but Matthew notes in particular that this is the second loud cry that Jesus uttered. As he says, Jesus cried out again. It's noteworthy in this regard that there are 2 places in Psalm 22 where the psalmist mentions crying out to the Lord. The first is connected to the opening lines, the most famous, but the second occurs toward the end of the psalm after a major shift in the psalm toward confident hope. In these lines, the psalmist reflects in verse 24, for he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has he hidden his face from him. But when he cried to him for help, he heard. So within the scope of Psalm 22, the psalmist reflects on the experience of not hearing an answer to his cries in the beginning of the psalm, alongside of the confidence that the Lord has in fact heard his cry in verse 24 at the end of the psalm. While this may seem like a strange juxtaposition, this paradoxical pairing is very familiar to readers of the Psalms of Lament. In the context of Jesus' teaching and crucifixion, we might ask, what is the evidence that Jesus is right in his understanding of the Father and of the Christ? Is Jesus' understanding of himself and his messianic sacrifice accurate? Or is the carping of the crowds the correct interpretation of what we see in the bloodied corpse of Jesus on the cross? Is he the one who was to come, or is he just another impostor in a long line of false prophets? The overwhelming testimony of the biblical writers is that the resurrection is the conclusive evidence that Jesus is who he says he is, and that the Father has in fact heard his cry. Significantly, then, immediately following Jesus' second cry and final breath, Matthew recalls several physical shockwaves that point to the theological significance of the cross. The curtain of the temple was torn from top to bottom. The earth shook. The rocks were split. The tombs were open. This is verse 51 and 52. At this point, there's a rather odd account that seems to be temporally dislocated. Matthew recounts that in verse 53, many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Now, the miracle of a group of the dead who had been raised is certainly remarkable. I sometimes call this Matthew's zombie apocalypse. The fact that, in this sense, Matthew doesn't record the raising of Lazarus, but he does also include additional resurrection accounts here, the raising accounts of these saints, this group of saints that he doesn't tell us much more about, but that were raised at Jesus's crucifixion, and then appeared to many in the city. But one of the interesting things here is that Matthew notes also when they appeared to the city, after Jesus' resurrection. So this brief account contributes to the eschatological overtones of this scene for sure, but it also essentially functions as a literary flash forward. We flashed forward to a time after Jesus' resurrection. So before Matthew has even finished his account of Jesus' death, he gives us a glimpse of Jesus' coming resurrection. The very next sentence in verse 54 takes us right back to the time and place of the crucifixion, as the centurion and the soldiers respond to what they had just witnessed. They were awestruck and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." So here Matthew has gone past the resurrection, told us something that happened after it, and then zipped back to the resurrection. So if we flashed forward, and then we flashed back. Matthew's going to go on to give an extended treatment of Jesus' burial and resurrection in a subsequent section. The resurrection preview in verses 52 and 53, though, seem to pressure us as readers to interpret Jesus' death and resurrection together. This pattern of death and resurrection also resonates with the rhythm of lament that we find in the Psalms of lament, like Psalm 22, which also juxtaposes both sorrow and hope repeatedly within the same account. This is significant as well because sometimes people say, well, Jesus is only quoting the first part of the psalm and you can't import the rest of the psalm like all the way at the end when what is cited is the first part of the psalm. But in Psalm 22 is one of those that juxtapose sorrow and hope several times throughout the psalm. So as you read through Psalm 22, there's an expression of sorrow. There's also an expression of hope. It flips back and forth several times, similar to Psalm 42. So you actually don't have to wait till you get to the end of Psalm 22 to hear an expression of trust. Those sit side by side within the psalm. A final point of possible contact with the shape of Psalm 22 occurs in Jesus' post-resurrection greeting to the women who find the empty tomb. Jesus tells them in chapter 27, verses 9 and 10, or 28, 9 and 10. He says, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers. Go to Galilee, and there you will see me." So calling the disciples my brothers is not necessarily out of place, but it is notable. In the crescendo section of Psalm 22, the psalmist declares, "I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you." Now, the final scene of Matthew's narrative is a gathering of the disciples into a small assembly where they see and worship Jesus. Chapter 28, verse 17. There, in the midst of this great commission, Jesus speaks of God's name to his brothers, the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. A possible interbiblical confirmation of the strategic significance of Psalm 22 for understanding Jesus' death and resurrection is the letter to the Hebrews. In a section that examines the theological implications of the incarnation, the writer notes that Jesus, and this is in Hebrews 5, Jesus was for a little while made lower than the angels. No, sorry, this is Psalm Hebrews 2. We're about to go to chapter 5. The writer notes in chapter 2 that Jesus was for a little while made lower than the angels so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Hebrews 2:9. For it was fitting, the writer says, that in bringing many sons to glory, God should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. The writer then quotes Psalm 22, verse 22, alongside Isaiah 8. He says, "That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children God has given me." Hebrews 2:11 through 13. Finally, after discussing the nature of Christ's priestly work later in the letter, the writer says in Hebrews 5:7, "In the days of his flesh," referring to the incarnation, "Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who is able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence." Although he was a son, the writer continues, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all those who obey him. Here the writer describes what we've discussed as Jesus' lament, and also indicates that Jesus was heard because of his faithfulness. This way of summarizing Jesus' suffering resonates well with our basic reading of Jesus' language of lament, including his cry of Psalm 22 from the cross. Recognizing the full extent of the interbiblical connection between Matthew's crucifixion account and Psalm 22, it helps us understand both the depth of Jesus' suffering and the anchor of his hope. On the one hand, through his human nature, God the Son experiences a human death. In this sense, Jesus has a genuine experience of being forsaken. He died a brutal death that he did not deserve. The language of lament helps us grasp the emotional and spiritual turmoil of this harrowing experience. On the other hand, he never experiences a broken fellowship with his Father or his Spirit, and he endures this suffering as the culmination of his own messianic mission. Jesus endures the cross, but is not abandoned to the grave. He is not saved from death, but through death. In this, Jesus embodies the rhythm of lament for us and for our salvation. Jesus' startling declaration from the cross was thus a scream of lament rather than an isolated cry of dereliction. Jesus' anguished exclamation is not an empty container that must be filled with psychological speculation, but comes loaded with interbiblical and theological freight. The gospel writers show us the darkness of the crucifixion, but they have also intentionally illuminated the meaning of the cross with the poetic and prophetic floodlights of messianic expectation. The subtle and overt references to the Psalms of Lament are not the riddle to be solved, but the answer to what kind of framework we need in order to understand the meaning and significance of the death of Christ. So in that sense, the way in which Matthew and Jesus himself points us to Psalm 22 is the answer to what kind of framework would help us understand both the depth of Jesus' suffering and the hope that enabled him to endure it. One last example to consider are the words of Jesus that are recounted by Luke in his crucifixion scene. After one of the criminals requests, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom," Jesus says in Luke 23:42 and 43, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Luke next recounts the darkness in the land and the tearing of the temple veil. At this moment, Jesus speaks his last words before his death in verse 46 of chapter 23 in Luke. Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, says, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last. While these words seem to be in utter contrast to Matthew's words, to the words of Jesus in Matthew and Mark's account, this phrase too is a direct allusion to a psalm of lament. This psalm of David begins with a hopeful plea in the first few verses. It shifts to a description of his distress and then returns to resounding confidence at the end of the psalm. David prays to the Lord, "You are my rock and my fortress, and for your name's sake you lead and guide me," in verse 3. He then affirms the Lord's protection in verse 4. "You take me out of the net that they have hidden for me, for you are my refuge." The words that directly follow these are the ones that Jesus speaks from the cross. "Into your hands I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God." 31:5. Significantly, Jesus here addresses this statement of surrender directly to the Father, with whom he shares an eternal and unbroken relationship. The closing portion of this psalm also describes the characteristic dynamic of biblical lament. The psalmist expresses confidence, but also the memory of distress. In Psalm 31, 21, and 22, he says, "Blessed be the Lord, for he has wondrously shown his steadfast love to me when I was besieged in a city. I said in my alarm, I am cut off from your sight. But you heard the voice of my pleas for mercy when I cried to you for help." So, taken synoptically, Jesus' cries from the cross express the rhythm of lament in a powerful way. My God, why have you forsaken me?" is a genuine cry of anguish from Jesus in the context of deep theological belief in God's covenant loyalty. "Into your hands I commit my spirit" is a genuine expression of hopeful expectation in the context of deeply felt physical and emotional pain. In the logic of lament, these gripping refrains rhyme rather than reek of contradictory confusion. So, the theological framework of biblical lament helps explain the dynamic tension that these statements represent. These two expressions also resonate with the two sides of Jesus' resolve in the Garden of Gethsemane. In Luke 22:42, Jesus says, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." So to summarize our session and some of the significance for Matthew's use of the Old Testament and kind of Matthew's theology of the cross, some of the central components of this reading of the crucifixion account is one, that Matthew's passion narrative intentionally echoes Psalm 22 from beginning to end. So not just a few random connections, but that the portrayal of Psalm 22 is a template for Matthew's account of Jesus' crucifixion. And this helps us, gives us a framework for what we are seeing and how we are to understand the meaning and significance of Jesus' death. Second, Jesus' cry from the cross is a scream of lament, not a cry of dereliction. This poetic rhythm, anguish leading to assurance, this shapes the way we should hear Jesus' cries. The first cry names the agony of suffering. The second anticipates trust and completion. And finally, the resurrection is God's definitive response to that cry. The forsakenness of the cross gives way to the vindication of Easter. Resurrection is the Father's answer to the Son's lament. Through lament, and we can say finally, Jesus expresses genuine human anguish while also revealing perfect trust in the Father and inaugurating the hope of resurrection. In this sense, the cross is not the breaking of divine fellowship, but the fullest expression of divine triune action. Father, Son, and Spirit together accomplish redemption. Psalm 22 begins, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And it ends, "He has not hidden his face from me." He has not hidden his face from him. When he cried to him, he heard. That's the movement of Matthew's gospel as well, from the darkness of the cross to the light of resurrection morning. At the heart of the Christian story is not divine forsakenness, but divine faithfulness, a God who is present even in the silence, who turns lament into praise, and who redeems the world through the suffering of his Son. That is what Matthew's narrative theology of the cross is all about.